While German pilots initially laughed at the bulky American fighter they called the Barrel in World War II, they would soon learn to fear the devastating power of its .850 caliber machine guns and its near-indestructible airframe. After all, it didn't get nicknames like the Jug and Tank Buster for nothing. But the real story is actually much darker and, well, as you could imagine, the gruesome effectiveness of this flying fortress made it one of the most feared aircraft in the German military. Okay, so let's go back now and explain why and how what would turn out to be the P-47 was created. In 1939, the United States Army Air Corps had a problem. Combat reports coming from Europe showed that American fighter designs were falling behind the German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. They needed something better, and fast. The request went to Republic Aviation, where Georgian immigrant Alexander Kartveli served as chief designer. Initially, Kartveli proposed the AP-10, a lightweight fighter powered by an Allison V-1710 engine with just 2 machine guns. It was supposed to be small, nimble, and weigh around 4,600 pounds. But then everything changed. By early 1940, more detailed combat reports revealed that what they really needed wasn't a lightweight interceptor, but a heavily armed, well-protected fighter that could dominate at high altitude. The Army Air Corps issued new requirements: 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, an armament of 6 or preferably .850 caliber machine guns, cockpit armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a minimum fuel load of 315 gallons. These weren't suggestions, they were demands. Kartveli went back to the drawing board and came up with something nobody expected. In June 1940, he submitted a completely redesigned fighter. Gone was the lightweight Allison engine. In its place was the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. To make it effective at high altitude, Kartveli added a turbocharger system in the rear fuselage, requiring extensive ducting from the engine to the back and then forward again. This added tremendous weight and complexity. As for armament, he went all in, mounting 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing. Kartveli himself admitted, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." He had no idea just how right he would be. The XP-47B prototype first flew on May 6, 1941, and despite some minor issues, it was impressive. When fully loaded, this beast weighed around 10,000 pounds empty, making it nearly twice as heavy as a Spitfire and significantly heavier than the P-51 Mustang. It was the largest single-engine fighter built by any nation during World War II. The Army Air Corps ordered it into production, and by March 1942, the first P-47Bs were being delivered. The production model, designated the P-47 Thunderbolt, was about to go to war. But first, American pilots needed to learn how to fly this unconventional machine. April 15, 1943. At 25,000 feet over occupied Belgium, Captain Werner Schroer of the German Fighter Wing, 26, saw American fighters approaching his formation and could barely believe his eyes. He radioed his squadron. "The Americans are flying barrels." Compared to the sleek German fighters, the agile Bf-109s and powerful FW-190s, these Republic P-47 Thunderbolts looked absurd. Their massive round engines, thick fuselages, and relatively short wings made them seem more like flying cargo containers than combat aircraft. German pilots, experienced and confident from years of air combat, had no respect for these newcomers. What threat could these bulky planes possibly pose? But beneath that awkward shape lay a surprise. The P-47 wasn't designed for elegance. It was designed for strength and firepower. Weighing about 10,000 pounds empty and powered by that 2,000-plus horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine, it could reach high altitudes where German engines struggled. It couldn't match the Germans in turn rate or low-altitude climb initially, but in other ways it was unmatched. And the Germans were about to learn this the hard way. The true power lay in its armament. Those 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 425 rounds, gave the Thunderbolt a total of 3,400 rounds of ammunition. When all 8 guns fired together, they could spray about 100 bullets per second into a target zone roughly 6 feet wide. American engineers had refined their placement through extensive testing, tuning the timing so that all bullets converged at about 300 yards into a small, lethal zone. The firepower was devastating. As top ace Captain Francis Gabreski later said, when the P-47's guns hit a target, the enemy didn't just fall, they disintegrated. On June 26, 1943, Lieutenant Robert Johnson was flying as part of a 48-aircraft P-47 formation escorting bombers returning from a raid on France. The formation was suddenly ambushed by 16 German Focke-Wulf FW-190s diving from above. Before Johnson could react, his Thunderbolt was hammered by cannon fire. 20-millimeter shells exploded through his aircraft, smashing the canopy, destroying his instrument panel, and filling the cockpit with smoke and flames. Hot oil covered what remained of his windscreen, and hydraulic fluid sprayed everywhere, nearly blinding him. A stray machine gun round nicked his nose, destroying his oxygen mask. The P-47 began spinning out of control. Johnson desperately tried to bail out, bracing his feet against the cockpit and pulling back on the jammed canopy with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. He was trapped, resigned to what seemed like certain death. Then, miraculously, the fire went out on its own, and Johnson managed to regain control of his battered aircraft. Half-blinded by hydraulic fluid, weak from lack of oxygen, and flying without instruments, he turned toward the English Channel and home. That's when things got worse. A blue and yellow FW-190 appeared behind him. It was flown by German ace Lieutenant Colonel Egon Mayer, one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled pilots. Mayer closed in and opened fire at point-blank range. Johnson's Thunderbolt shook violently as 20-millimeter cannon shells and 7.92-meter machine gun rounds tore through it. Somehow, impossibly, the rugged Republic-built aircraft stayed in the air. Mayer pulled alongside, examined the shattered Thunderbolt up and down, and shook his head in mystification. How was this plane still flying? Mayer moved back behind Johnson and fired again. And again. Each time, the battered P-47 absorbed the punishment and kept flying. The German pilot pulled alongside once more as they crossed over the English Channel. Still, the Thunderbolt flew. Finally, as they approached the English coast, Mayer positioned himself behind Johnson and fired one last burst. The P-47 kept going. Out of ammunition and seemingly in disbelief, Mayer pulled alongside one final time, rocked his wings in salute to Johnson's incredible survival, and turned back toward occupied France. Johnson nursed his crippled plane back to RAF Manston. When he finally landed, he had to be pried from the cockpit. Covered in shrapnel wounds, burns to his face, hands and legs, Johnson limped over to inspect his aircraft. He began counting bullet holes, but gave up after reaching 200, without even walking around the entire plane. The Thunderbolt had taken 21 hits from 20-millimeter cannon shells and more than 200 hits from 7.92-millimeter machine gun rounds. No German fighter could have survived such punishment. Word of Johnson's ordeal rippled through German squadrons. The Americans had built something different, something terrifying. The first reason German forces hated the P-47 was simple: it was everywhere. By 1945, the United States had built 15,783 Thunderbolts, making it the most produced American fighter. American industry had turned overwhelming firepower into standard doctrine, and it seemed that anything with wings on the battlefield had at least one heavily armed fighter attached to it. The Americans never suffered from the ammunition shortages that plagued the Germans. The sheer scale of production meant that German forces faced P-47s constantly, whether in the air or on the ground. The second reason was the devastating firepower. Those 850 caliber machine guns delivered between 5 and 10 times more energy than standard infantry weapons. A 2-second burst from all 8 guns launched 200 bullets at an enemy aircraft at 300 yards, creating a wall of lead nothing could survive. The ammunition included armor-piercing incendiary rounds that burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt aluminum instantly. When these rounds hit an aircraft, they didn't just damage it. They caused fuel tanks to explode, engines to disintegrate, and pilots to die instantly, often before they even knew they'd been hit. The psychological effect was immense. German ace Hans Philipp, a veteran with over 500 missions, met his end on October 8, 1943, when P-47s caught his formation at high altitude. Johnson's combat report was brief. Saw hits along the body, aircraft exploded, no parachute. If Philipp, one of Germany's best, couldn't survive an encounter with Thunderbolts, what hope did average pilots have? German fighter pilot Heinrich Baer later stated that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. The third reason was the P-47's incredible durability. That massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine was air-cooled, meaning it had no vulnerable radiator like the liquid-cooled German fighters. One hit to a Bf-109's cooling system meant the engine would seize and the pilot would be forced to bail out or crash. The P-47, by contrast, could lose entire cylinders and still fly home. There are documented cases of Thunderbolts returning to base with half their cylinder heads missing, massive chunks of wing shot away, or control systems nearly destroyed. The heavily armored cockpit protected pilots even when the aircraft took incredible damage. Many American pilots preferred to belly land damaged Thunderbolts rather than bail out because the airframe often held together when other fighters would have broken apart. While the P-47 initially served as a high-altitude escort fighter, by 1943 it found its true calling: ground attack. In March 1944, Major Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group pioneered low-level strafing tactics with the Thunderbolt. He found 16 volunteers who tested how the aircraft performed attacking ground targets. After 5 successful missions proving the concept, the 9th Air Force adopted ground attack as a primary role for the P-47. This decision terrified German ground forces. The Thunderbolt could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets in addition to its 8 machine guns. It had the strength to hit targets hard and the durability to survive intense anti-aircraft fire on the way back. P-47 pilots flew low, sometimes at just 50 feet, strafing anything that moved: tanks, trucks, trains, supply convoys, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. The effect was devastating. From D-Day in June 1944 until Germany's surrender in May 1945, Thunderbolt pilots claimed destruction of 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. During Operation Cobra near Rancy, France, on July 29, 1944, the 405th Fighter Group trapped a German column and attacked it for over 6 hours. Ground investigations afterward found 66 tanks, 204 vehicles, and 11 guns destroyed in that single attack. For German troops on the ground, the distinctive sound of P-47 radial engines became a sound of terror. The noise announced incoming devastation. If you were fighting from a house, concrete or brick walls wouldn't protect you. The 50 caliber rounds would either punch through the wall and kill you, or concentrated fire would collapse entire wall sections. Sandbag bunkers offered little protection. Sustained fire would shred them completely. Even the better armored German tanks like the Panzer IV could be penetrated from the side or rear, or have their optics, tracks, and turrets damaged. A U.S. Army Air Forces observer watching one P-47 strike on the road to Bad Dürkheim, Germany, in March 1945 wrote, "It is so enormous that the mind cannot measure it. The only impression made is that this is the acme and ultimate of death, destruction, and chaos." German forces adapted their tactics to counter P-47 attacks, shifting from movement during daylight to operating primarily at night, dispersing forces to minimize casualties from strafing runs, and prioritizing taking out P-47 pilots with snipers, tanks, or indirect fire whenever possible. For P-47 pilots, ground attack came with a psychological cost that many found difficult to bear. German logistics in the later years of the war relied heavily on horse-drawn supply columns due to fuel shortages. P-47 pilots were ordered to strafe these columns to prevent supplies from reaching the front lines. Tom Glenn of the 365th Fighter Group later said in his memoir that one of his saddest duties was strafing columns of horse-drawn guns and equipment. "The horses were not our enemy," Glenn recalled, "but our assignment was to prevent those columns from harming our troops." The gruesome aftermath sometimes made pilots physically ill. Tangled, bloody carcasses of horses, mixed with destroyed equipment and dead soldiers, created scenes of horror that haunted many airmen long after the war ended. Yet the strategic necessity was undeniable. Stopping German supplies meant saving Allied lives, regardless of how disturbing the methods. This moral burden extended to civilian casualties as well. While pilots tried to avoid harming non-combatants, the chaos of low-altitude combat at high speed made perfect target identification impossible. There are accounts of P-47s accidentally strafing civilian vehicles or hitting targets near populated areas. The violence necessary to win the war created ethical dilemmas that troubled many pilots for the rest of their lives. By late 1944, as Allied armies pushed into Germany, P-47s took on an even more unusual role: urban combat support. During the assault on Brest, a German-occupied coastal fortress city, the 9th Air Force reported, "In the final phases of the assault, fighter bombers were directed to attack individual houses which were obstructing progress of the ground attack, in effect, street fighting with P-47s." The aircraft proved so effective at this role that when General Major Botho Elster surrendered his entire command of 20,000 German troops to advancing American forces in September 1944, he pointedly surrendered not to the 9th Army's commanding general, but to the general's Army Air Force's representative. The symbolic gesture acknowledged what German commanders had learned. Allied air power, particularly the devastating P-47, had become impossible to counter effectively. German commander Gerd von Rundstedt later expressed the exasperation felt by many German soldiers when he told his captors that Allied air attacks had made it impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. While this was an overstatement, it reflected the genuine desperation German forces felt facing constant P-47 attacks. While ground attack became the P-47's signature role, it remained highly effective in air-to-air combat. By autumn 1943, American pilots learned to leverage the Thunderbolt's strengths. They avoided turning fights at low altitude where German fighters had the advantage. Instead, they climbed to 30,000 feet, where the turbocharged R-2800 engine gave them superiority. From that height, P-47s would dive at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, often outrunning German fighters even late in the war when jets like the Me-262 appeared. The diving speed was so extreme that pilots had to use careful throttle techniques to prevent propeller tips from approaching the sound barrier, which would shatter the blades under stress. German fighters caught in these high-speed dives had little chance of escape. The P-47's superior dive performance, combined with its devastating firepower, made it lethal in the hands of skilled pilots. Robert Johnson went on to score 27 aerial victories, all in the P-47. He became the first American fighter pilot in the European theater to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. Fellow ace Francis Gabreski also flew the Thunderbolt with the 56th Fighter Group Zemke's Wolfpack, scoring 28 victories. Together, these pilots and their squadrons proved that the bulky barrel German pilots had laughed at in 1943 was actually one of the most lethal aircraft in the sky. P-47s shot down 3,572 Luftwaffe aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter. Even as Germany introduced revolutionary jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 in 1944 and early 1945, the P-47 proved it could still compete. The Me-262 was faster than any propeller aircraft, capable of over 540 miles per hour and armed with 4 powerful 30mm cannons. German jet pilots initially felt invincible, but the jets had a critical weakness. They were vulnerable during takeoff and landing when their speed advantage disappeared. On March 14, 1945, 3 P-47s of the 62nd Fighter Squadron caught 2 Arado 234B jet bombers flying low, probably targeting the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, where American forces were pouring into Germany. The P-47Ms, using their superior diving speed, shot down both jets. 11 days later, Major George Bostwick and his wingman Edwin Crosthwaite caught 2 Me-262s coming in for a landing at Parcham Airfield and destroyed them both. These victories proved that skill, tactics, and the P-47's strengths could overcome even the technological advantage of jet engines. On April 13, 1945, the 56th Fighter Group executed one of the war's most devastating attacks. After failing to encounter enemy fighters on an escort mission, they descended on Egebek Airfield. Their chattering machine guns expended 85,000 rounds, destroying 95 parked aircraft on the ground. The new incendiary ammunition proved especially effective. An Air Force report later noted that enemy aircraft burned after having been hit only 2 or 3 times. There's a grim reason why German soldiers particularly feared being caught by P-47 strafing runs, and it relates to the devastating effect of 50 caliber rounds on the human body. When a 50 caliber bullet strikes a person, the hydrostatic shock and energy transfer cause catastrophic damage. If hit in a limb, that limb is often severed completely. If hit in the torso, the wound is almost always fatal. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds used by P-47s added a horrific element. They would burn through tissue at temperatures that could ignite clothing and cause secondary burns. German soldiers who witnessed the aftermath of P-47 strafing attacks described scenes too gruesome to detail here. Bodies weren't just killed, they were destroyed beyond recognition. This created a psychological terror that went beyond normal combat fear. Soldiers knew that if they were caught in the open by a Thunderbolt, there would be no wounded survivors, no chance to be carried to a field hospital. There would only be death, sudden and total. The German military's frustration was compounded by the fact that they had nothing comparable to the P-47. Their heavy machine gun was still the MG-42, firing 7.92 mm rounds, while the MG-42 had an impressive rate of fire when mounted on the Lafette tripod for long-range work. The ammunition lacked the destructive power of 50 caliber rounds. The closest thing Germany had to the P-47 was their 13 mm heavy machine gun, but it was used only on fighter aircraft and in limited quantities. The Germans did plan to use captured P-47s in some cases. They mounted at least one captured Thunderbolt at an airfield and marked it with German insignia for evaluation. They even produced copies of 50 caliber ammunition for potential use with captured American heavy machine guns, which shows they respected the weapon system. But actual combat use of captured P-47s occurred only rarely, and the Germans never developed their own equivalent ground attack aircraft with similar capabilities. By the war's end, the P-47 Thunderbolt had proven itself as one of the most versatile and effective combat aircraft of World War II. It destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter, devastated German ground forces with an effectiveness that changed modern warfare, and proved nearly indestructible in combat, earning the undying loyalty of pilots who flew it. American pilots joked about the aircraft's size and weight, but they loved it for bringing them home alive. The P-47's legacy continued after World War II. It served in the Korean War, where its durability again proved valuable, and the concept lived on in its spiritual successor, the A-10 Thunderbolt Useku, designed in the 1970s for the same ground attack role. Like its ancestor, the A-10 is not beautiful or graceful, but it's tough, heavily armed, and feared by enemy ground forces. For the Germans in World War II, the P-47 represented everything they came to fear about American military power: overwhelming production, devastating firepower, incredible durability, and the willingness to use all of it without hesitation. What began as mockery in April 1943 turned to respect by autumn, and finally to dread as the Thunderbolts dominated the skies over Europe. As one German pilot reportedly said after examining a shot-up P-47 that had somehow made it home, "We do not build fighters like this. We cannot build fighters like this, and now we understand why we are losing this war." The P-47 Thunderbolt, the flying barrel that became a flying nightmare, a testament to the engineers who designed it, the pilots who flew it, and the brutal reality of modern warfare where survival often depends not on elegance, but on raw, unstoppable power.